Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your invitation, being here, and being able to bring Robert with me has been a blessing and a joy. I got to take Isaiah, he's 13, to the Pennsylvania family camp, and he and I got to hang out. But this is normal. This is kind of getting normal for Robert and I. He'll go play somewhere and I'll preach, so we're enjoying that. And but tomorrow morning we're going to take that 14-hour trek back to Indiana, because as some of you guys know, Located Ministry is calling your name. And Sunday's always coming. But I've got 4 kids, ages 24, and Lord willing, my son will have an official job offer tomorrow night. He'll be a 4th grade school teacher at Shoals Community Schools. The school board meets tomorrow night. He's already been in his room, but you got to wait, you know. And Robert's 21. He'll graduate here soon. And then I've got a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I realized I didn't plan that out very well. But I wouldn't trade it for nothing. But my wife reminded me of something. I had forgotten all about this. She said, you realize that the people at Delmarva knew that I was pregnant with Jonathan before some of my family did? No, I didn't. I don't forget. And so what had happened was we were pregnant one time. We were going to, and my wife had what's called a miscarriage. We didn't know the babies. It was twins. We didn't know they had passed. We didn't know they were twins until that moment. And so when she gets ultimately pregnant again with Jonathan, we didn't tell a lot of people. We told my parents and a few close friends, and that was it. And if you've ever dealt with that, you know, I call it the joy killer, because you just cannot enjoy the pregnancy after that. You just, anytime Tina would make a noise, I go, you okay? I know she wanted to kill me by the time Jonathan was born. But Dad is going to be a grandfather, and he's very proud of that, and he's up here preaching, and he tells everybody about my nephew Zach, who was eventually born in December of '98, and then he tells everybody that Tina's pregnant, and then he goes, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to tell you that. And I wouldn't have found out except Jay Perrier had given me his sermon tape from Delmarva. So I called him later on. I said, well, you outed us, didn't you? He said, yeah, I'm sorry. But I felt pretty good about secrets. At that point, there was no social media. I wasn't worried about something getting from Delmarva to Georgia or Indiana. But Jonathan was born in 1999, February 1999. And so we would get up with him like you do with a newborn infant every night, somewhere around midnight, 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. He'd be hungry, and we'd get up, and Tina would feed him, and I would sit there. And I found out there's some really bad TV on at 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I have a habit that my wife does not like. I watch bad preachers. I am addicted to bad preachers. And if you want to know where to find them, they're on TBN. And so at 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, I would watch all these guys. And one of the ones that I started watching, I won't tell you his name, but it starts with Jack Van Impe. And it's 1999, and you remember what was going to happen December the 31st, 1999, right? At the stroke of midnight, January the 1st, all the computers were going to freeze, all the planes were going to crash, terrible things were going to happen, you know, that kind of thing. And Jack Van Impe was convinced that Jesus was going to come back at the end of 1999. And I heard this over and over again. And a little bit later, I entered seminary, and I met a man. I'd already met him, but I got to know a man named Bob Lowry. And long story short, I worked with Bob Lowry through some of my New Testament stuff in seminary, and I went through he and I and a couple of classmates, and I took a class with him on the book of Revelation. And if you're like me, I had not really dealt with it at all. If somebody asked me if I'd preached the whole counsel of God, I'd tell them yes, but I probably hadn't. And if you're like me, you get through chapter 1, and it's about Jesus, and that's pretty easy. You go through the 7 churches in chapter 2 and 3. You go through chapter 4 and 5, and it's a little different, but I think it's easy to figure out. But then in chapter 6, you hit what I call the revelation wall. It just goes bonkers after that. And you're just all over the place, right? And you just can't figure it out. And I think it was Matt Proctor who said that Revelation is a lot like, if you take the New Testament and you turn it into a street, the Gospels are on the good side of the street where everybody gives out good candy bars at Halloween, and they have all their Christmas decorations up, and you get down, and at the end of the street, in the dark of the cul-de-sac, is this house that nobody goes near, nobody wants to be around it, and that would be the book of Revelation. because it's kind of scary. I don't want anything to do with stuff like that. But I took this class and I read a couple of books, and what I think is happening here is we have too many people like Jack and some of these other guys who try to fit all these events. We're going to look at seals, trumpets, and bowls today. So we'll start in chapter 6 and we'll move around a little bit. They try to fit every event into all these events in the Bible. So all of a sudden, a president gets elected that we don't like, and he's somewhere involved in some seal or trumpet somewhere. A hurricane comes, and somehow that hurricane has something to do with this, and it has something to do with that, and we just get all confused. But here's what I think is happening. I'm just going to go ahead and say this now. If you're like me, I like football. I love college football. John and I were talking about college game day earlier over here while I was eating my grits. Thank you, by the way, for that. And every Saturday morning by 9 o'clock, I was awake, I was ready to go, I had my cup of coffee, and I was going to spend the next 6 hours with ESPN on. My wife didn't like that either, but I would. I love college football. And nowadays, you can see anything you want, and you can see it replayed thousands of times. There are cameras above you, there are cameras on the field, even those little pylons at the end of the end zones have cameras in them. And what you're doing is you're seeing the same event from different angles. And I think that's what the seals, trumpets, and bowls are. I think it's the exact same event at different angles. Revelation is probably written in 90-95 AD. There's a lot of horrible things going on for Christians. That late first century was a tough time to be a Christian. And so Jesus, through John, is trying his best to explain what is going to happen and what is happening, and he's just trying to explain it so over and over and over again. So don't look at Revelation and think prediction. Think of it as a time where we can get together and we can learn how to thrive during difficult times. Don't try to fit the events we're going to hear about over the next few minutes into some historical timeline, because they're not going to fit. Because people think they can make this fit and then they can predict the end of the world, and it doesn't work that way. But here's the first thing I want you to know. Before we get started, here's the first thing you need to know. Jesus is the Lord of history. There's nothing going to change that. Jesus is the Lord of history. Jesus is in control of everything. Even when his people are suffering, Jesus is in control of the situation. And so the Apostle John writes this letter, and it's going to be read by 7 different churches. I also believe it wasn't only read by those 7 churches. If you read the book of Colossians, you know, what did Paul say? Make sure the church of Hierapolis leads your letter, and make sure you read their letter. So I think there were other churches, not just those 7 churches, that would have read this letter and would have had it given to them. And they are facing suffering like few people have ever suffered. So John's taken the same scene, the same event, and he shows it from 3 different perspectives. He uses 3 different images to paint the picture, and these images are strange to us today. They may scare us, but it's to bring hope and encouragement to the original recipients of the letter. Now here's another clue. Here can help you. Every book of the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, every book of the Bible has to have meaning to the original hearers. You do understand that the people in 95 AD in Ephesus wasn't listening to this letter being read to them and thought to themselves, I really wish I was going to be alive in 2023 so I knew this was what this means. They didn't sit there and go, wow, that's great. What does that mean? Now look, I've preached some sermons where people thought, what does that mean? I have no idea what he's talking about. Every preacher has. But that's not what's happening here. He doesn't want his audience to miss the point. And the point is, how do you answer the crowd? How do you act when things get tough? Dennis says we're in exile, and I agree with him. He's right. How are we going to act? How do we respond to suffering? There's all kind of suffering. Sometimes we suffer because we live in a fallen world. Tornadoes and car wrecks and cancer and stuff like that. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in my living room on a Sunday afternoon getting ready to grab my 2 youngest kids, take them to church because church was going to start at 6 o'clock, and I wanted to go in a little early to go over. I'm going through Romans, so I had some stuff I just really wanted to go over and lock in on before I sat down to present this. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting on the couch, and I hear this sound. And after about a minute of this sound going off, I'm thinking, what in the world? What's going on here? And it was the tornado siren. So I'm screaming at Josiah and I'm screaming at Isaiah, get your shoes on. We're going to go to the church because the church has a really big basement in it, and it's rock solid. They had to dig through rock to build this basement. I figure if we're going to be safe anywhere, it'll be there. I open the door, and there's no way we're going anywhere, right? Trees are blowing. We're not going anywhere. So Josiah says, where do we go? Where do we go? So there's a closet, and all of a sudden Robert comes out of his bedroom, and I said, what are you doing home? I didn't know you were home. So I was about to take 2 kids to safety, but I was going to leave one at home, I guess, you know. But the tornado bypasses this, but unfortunately it went about 6 miles away from us, and it destroyed a home, and a man in that home was killed, and his wife was injured. And I never realized how bad it was until the next morning. Derek texts me and goes, are you guys okay? I guess we're okay. My friend Brian Schultz texts me, are you okay? I guess I'm okay. And then it comes on the news what all had happened. We knew the tornado had hit in Lost River, but we just weren't sure of the extent of the damage, you know, that kind of thing. But sin has entered the world, and we have to face stuff like this. And the Apostle Paul says sometimes we also know as a Christian, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So what do you do when things get tough? And I think what we want to talk about is remind ourselves is let suffering bring us closer to Jesus Christ. Because that's what these chapters can help us with as we talk today. These chapters really get tough. War, famine, earthquakes, stars falling to earth, locusts. I mean, what is a warrior locust? Things are getting so bad that in chapter 6, one of the seals is open, and there's Christians who have been martyred for their faith, and they ask God, how long, much longer is this going to take? You got to do something about this. And God's saying, a little bit longer. Hold on. And so John takes his pen and he writes to the church. And here's the point. God has done something about human suffering. He's doing something about human suffering. And one day he'll do something to end it all. And as we get into these chapters, we'll see the 7 seals being opened and the 7 trumpets being blown and the 7 bowls poured out. And all of this represents God's judgment. And the first, there's 2 phases of God's judgment. And the first one is tribulation. The word tribulation is found 45 times in the New Testament. It's found in the Greek word thalipsis, and it means trouble or distress. You've heard Jesus say, in this world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow has enough tribulation as its own. And we all face tribulation. You know, the other thing I don't like about these guys who say things about these books of the Bible, these faith-only guys and all this kind of stuff, is some of them teach that if you become a Christian, all of your problems will be gone. That somehow God will remove every problem for your life. And I believe God comforts us. And I believe God does stuff like that, but that's in the future. Jesus taught we can expect difficulty. So don't be surprised when things are difficult. So let's look at this from 3 different angles. Here's the first angle John gives us. Same event, first angle is the 7 seals. Chapter 6 opens with these seals of the scroll being open and the 4 horsemen riding in. And these visions are kind of uneasy for us. You know, one of the things I like to say is the 4 horsemen shatter the illusion that we can find security in the borders of a nation or an empire. We can't find security in our country. We can't find security there. The rider on the white horse with a crown on his head and a bow in his hand, he comes out, and that's military conquest. And then any time an earthly leader has been on conquering other nations, well, the second horse has to follow. That red horse that's holding a large sword of bloodshed and that comes on the battlefield. And we've all seen the human casualties that can happen. And clipping at that heel is the black horse, which brings the harsh economic realities that's associated with those kinds of things, and the famine and the innocent who suffer as a result of man's ambition and power to rule. And that, of course, leads to the pale horse dragging corpses behind it in a wagon. And that's the things that could or have happened. That's the kind of things that will happen and continue to happen. God's people cry out in verse 10, they called out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and spill their blood. And all God says is, well, hold on. I'll get around to it. And the sixth seal is broken, and immediately after, an earthquake hits the sky grows dark, and the stars begin to fall from the sky, and the mountains are uprooted from the earth. And we're not really sure what to do with that until you realize that language is the exact same language that Isaiah uses in Isaiah 13 when he talks about the fall of Babylon. It's the exact same language that's used in Isaiah 24 to describe the fall of Tyre. It's the exact same language that Ezekiel uses in chapter 32 when he talks about the fall of Egypt. And it's the exact same language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24, which, when he speaks of, not his second coming, by the way, but the fall of Rome. The only thing Jesus says in Matthew 24 about the second coming is, I don't know when it's going to be. That's all Jesus says. But there's that same terminology. What's the Christians in the first century think when they hear this thing? Rome won't stand forever. Rome's going to fall. Verse 15 of chapter 6. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of the Lord has come. Who can stand? And when a tyrant goes to war, eventually God will dethrone him. Stalin killed 60 million of his fellow Russians, but God dethroned him. Mao killed 40 million Chinese people, and the same thing happened to Hitler for killing 6 million Jews. They all met God eventually. But when they go away, someone else shows up that we have to deal with. So that first camera angle, that first there is a picture of what was, what is, and what will be until Jesus establishes his throne on the new earth and restores peace to a cursed universe. We're going to face tribulation. We're going to endure times of struggle and difficulties and persecution, and it's just a reality in our world. And tribulation, the real message of tribulation is not how it fits into someone's timeline of interpretation, but how it fits into my own life. Paul tells us to use that to come closer to Christ. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution, famine or nakedness, danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we shall face death all day long. We are considered a sheep to a slaughter. But in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. So, in the meantime, here's what you can hold on to. There's coming a day when the power of love will overcome the love of power. So that's the message of the first angle. Here it is. You ready? Hold on. His help is on the way. Then we come to the second camera angle, the 7 trumpets. There's this catastrophic brass band, and after the first trumpet is sounded, a third of the earth is burned up. With the second trumpet, a third of the sea is contaminated. The third trumpet, a third of fresh water supply is contaminated. After the fourth trumpet, the sky kind of gets smogged, and a third of the sky goes dark. So we have all these, the first 4 trumpets is directed towards nature. Yet as God's children are killed in the wars of men, we also have to suffer during the natural disasters of this earth, right along with the wicked. There were Christians who were killed in the tsunami back in 2004, just like there were non-Christians killed in the tsunami. There are Christians killed in tornadoes, just like there are non-Christians killed in tornadoes and earthquakes and things like that. We don't have any control over stuff like that. But then in trumpet 5 and 6, the songs and these terrifying creatures appear from the abyss, and they look like locusts. But they're not just any locusts. These locusts are armed for battle. And you may or may not know this. I hadn't known this for years because I never grew up on a farm or anything like that. Locust is this kind of the most destructive insect. Locusts are kind of considered, that can be the most destructive insect. They can go in swarms and completely darken out the sun. In fact, we know they can travel in large swarms, and the largest recorded one is 4 miles long. In 1866, locusts descended on the country of Algiers, and there was nothing living after they were gone. And hundreds of thousands of people starved to death in 3 months after those locusts left because of the devastation that they caused. But John tells us these locusts have tails like scorpions, and he goes on to say that they have human faces with long hair on their heads, and they're skilled at riding horses. Now, historically speaking, there's a good chance that the Christians in the Roman time would have thought of the Parthians. Not that that's who he's talking about. That's just maybe they would have talked about. The Parthians were a fierce army. They had brilliant tactics of war. They used horses. They had long hair. They took a lot of slaves, and it was the only army that Rome was afraid of. You don't hear a lot about that, but they were afraid of the Parthians. They didn't like messing with them because they were merciless killers, and the Parthian army was the only army, like I said, Rome feared. But who is this really about? Well, in the storyline, what is this about? Well, for 19 centuries, we know what this is about. This is Satan, right? I think we're dealing with Satan and his armies, his demons. But you know what else you know about locusts? After all this destruction they can do, do you know how long locusts live? 5 months. Locusts have a lifespan of 5 months. What does that tell us? Satan can lead havoc around the globe, but it's only going to happen for a short time. I mean, we know that it's Satan and his armies that's behind addictions and divorce and pornography and abortion and abuse and suicide. But one of my friends said one day they're going to face the biggest bug zapper you've ever seen. So what's the second angle? What is this message of the second angle? This second camera angle, hold on. Help is on the way. Now, real quick, beware of any teachings that tries to put the locust in a particular timeline in history. I'll give you a great example. In the 70s, everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people fell in love with the late, great planet Earth. They thought Hal Lindsey had solved the puzzle, and they were lined up to hear everything he had to say, and they were going to buy all of his books. And he even had a comic book he put out for kids during Sunday school, right? And so he said that the locusts were the Apache helicopters that were used during the Vietnam War. But did you know that Hal Lindsey wrote a second edition to the late great planet Earth? He wrote it around 1990, and guess what the locusts were then? They were the Scud missiles they used during the first Gulf War. I don't know what he thinks they are now. But what happens when we do stuff like that and we try to put these events, these things in just a timeline, all that happens is the same thing that happens all the time. We have to rewrite books to correct the incorrect predictions we made because of the first one. We were wrong the first time or the second time. So that brings us very quickly to camera angle number 3, the 7 bowls. And those are found in chapter 16. And there's these angels, and they're carrying these bowls, and it pours out plagues on the earth. And it kind of reminds you, or it should remind you, of Moses in Egypt. In fact, you need to understand the Exodus to understand most of the Bible. The reason and what happened in the Exodus. And then Moses leads Israel out of Egypt because of these plagues. And the plagues in the Exodus were meant to get God's people out of Egypt, and I think the plagues in Revelation are meant to get Egypt out of God's people. And from this angle, it is clear that God has reached his limit. He is done. He's reached his limit with sin and Satan and the suffering of his people. And once and for all, God wants to set his people free from the oppression and the slavery that sin causes. This is why John tells us in his vision, God dried up the Euphrates River. Because the Euphrates River is a picture of God making a path through the Red Sea to lead his people out. And God is leading his people back where it all began. Remember, the Garden of Eden was placed between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And what happened once the Egyptian army made it through? They were destroyed. Once God's people made it through, the Egyptians were destroyed. And the same is going to happen to Satan's army. Once we make it through, they're all destroyed. So what's the message of the third angle? Well, hold on. Help is on the way. But you see, what we're doing right now, I believe we're in a period of time that Bible scholars call the interlude. Between the 6th and 7th seal, between the 6th and 7th trumpet, between the 6th and 7th bowl, because once you read this, once you get to the end of those, the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet, and the 7th bowl, I believe Jesus returns at the end of all 3 of them. Now, Jesus is only going to come back one time. Chapter 6, it talks about how the sky rolled up and the mountains were falling. That sounds like the end of the world to me. In chapter 4 of Revelation, each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes around and its wings. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. But in Revelation chapter 11, although it's added in some versions, it's really supposed to say who was and who is. When the seventh trumpet is opened in chapter 11, they don't say who is to come. Why? He's already there. But then you have to go through chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14. See, it's just repeating it all over again. Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. Help is on the way. Help is on the way. Help is on the way. And Jesus taught it would happen in the blink of an eye, quickly and simultaneously. And then John describes the second phase of God's judgment, and we call that Armageddon. This is not a literal battle that will take place in a literal place. The word Armageddon is only used one time in the Bible, and it refers to the valley outside of a town in Israel known as Megiddo. Now, I have been there. Have you ever been there? Anybody ever been there? Do you know you can barely put 5 of these campers in there? It's a really small area. There's no way the nations of the world are going to fit in Megiddo. It's just not going to happen. But back then, it was part of a major highway system in the ancient world that connected Egypt and Syria. And for centuries, it was a battleground for a lot of military battles, because if you controlled that area, you controlled everything that went through that area. But here's what I want you to tell you real quick before we go any further. God's punishment of the wicked will match God's love for you. I know that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that he that believes will be saved. But John chapter 3:16 is balanced out by John chapter 3, verse 17. And God's wrath will happen much like his kindness. And God's wrath is essential to his holiness. And Jesus is going to come back, and it won't be a gentle shepherd, and it won't just be a slain lamb. He will be a conquering king. And when Jesus returns, we will be rescued in that moment. Now, I know some people claim that's the rapture, and I think that's interesting since the word rapture is not even there. The word rapture is not even anywhere in the Bible. Jesus says 2 men will be working in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. If you put that in that context, it's the wicked person taken first, so I want to be left behind. I don't want that to happen to me. However, once we come to the Battle of Armageddon, we see in Revelation 20 that Jesus will obliterate Gog and Magog. Now, who are Gog and Magog? Well, it's any kingdom that comes against God. In the Old Testament, it was Egypt, it was Assyria, it was Babylon, it was the Greeks. The 1st and 2nd century, it was Rome. Maybe in my parents' generation, it could have been Germany. In my generation of the 80s, it could have been the Soviet Union. There's all kind of speculation, but that's not what's important. What we know is this: nations will rise and nations will fall, and the only one who will ever occupy the throne is the one who's always occupied the throne. Because at that moment, Jesus is going to direct his attention to the source of human suffering. And he's going to throw Satan into the lake of fire, burning and drowning, the 2 most horrible ways to die, I would think. And that's the fate of the one who's pestered and picked on us for our entire life. And then Jesus will gather all the peoples of the earth, and we'll join them for judgment, and 2 books will be opened. One is the book that's recorded everything you've ever said and done, the book of deeds. The other is the book of life. Both books represent the mind of God, because God sees and hears everything. He remembers everything. That's why I can't judge, because I don't know everything, but God does. And the Bible teaches that everything covered will be uncovered. Everything whispered will be shouted. And everything done in secret will be made known. You've heard the story, hadn't you, about the football player from Kentucky who sat next to the straight A student in biology class, and they got the same score on their final exam. Professor called him in the office. He set the papers down in front of them. Both of them only missed one. They got 49 out of 50. And the guy goes, "Can you explain this to me?" And the football player shrugged his shoulders. "It's a coincidence." And the professor said, "You know what? I could believe that if you sat on the opposite side of the room from each other. But I'm struggling with this because both of you missed the same question, number 17. And they were both looking at number 17. And the professor said to the A student, "You wrote, 'I don't know.'" And he looked at the football player and he said, "And you wrote, 'I don't know either.'" Now here's the thing. What secrets do you think you've gotten away with? We like to think no one saw us doing it. Imagine a book that is so utterly comprehensive and accurate about you. Would you want that book sold at Barnes & Noble? Well, if not, you need not choose to live your life in such a way from this point forward that you wouldn't be embarrassed if it were sold. And I want you to be aware of this reality, because Armageddon could happen today. And once it happens, there's no turning back. There's no second chance. You won't be able to slip the doorman some cash with a wink and a smile to get in the back door. Bill Gates' money's not going to do him any good. Michael Jordan's going to find out God's not waiting around for his autograph. You have to know who Jesus is and be known by Jesus. And you can fool your boss and you can fool your spouse and your children, but you won't be able to pull one over on Christ. But see, the best part, after all this public knowledge, God will turn to the second book, the book of life. And if he finds your name in that book, it means your debt has been paid and you're given access to the city of heaven. Our salvation is tied to what Jesus has done through us. And I know we cover a lot of ground, but let's go back to chapter 7 and verse 3. Here's what the angel says. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of God. In this culture, there was a seal that was placed on anything. It signifies two things, ownership and delivery. Okay? Paul says to the church at Ephesus in chapter 1, and you were included in Christ when you heard the message of the truth, the gospel of your salvation. When you believed, you were sealed in him. You were marked with him with the seal, the promise of the Holy Spirit, who is a deposit guaranteeing our inheritance until the redemption of those who are God's possession, to the praise of his glory. You know, everybody gets wrapped up in the mark of the beast, right? Nobody wants the mark of the beast. I know people who want their phone numbers changed because 666 is in the middle of it. And I really feel bad for those people. Because when I teach Revelation at Louisville Bible College, one of the first things I do, like second week class, is I just write 666 on the board, then I stand back to see what happens. Nothing happens. We go on with class. That's the point. But you know, Satan marks his territory. You understand? Jesus seals his. We're not marked by Jesus Christ. We are sealed by Jesus Christ, and we are sealed for protection from what's going to happen. And all these people are going to gather around. And we're going to be in heaven one day, and we get to sing, and we get to live together. And we're going to be given white robes just like the victorious soldiers after they came off the battlefield, because purity came through fighting and never giving up, even if it means dying for the King. And the Bible says, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes, and they've made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb who's at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. That's my favorite part of the book of Revelation. And when stuff like ministry and school and sickness and politics get us down, that's what you got to go to. You got to go to those verses. Because that's the fulfillment of everything God promised in the name of Emmanuel. All hunger and thirst is filled. Our Lamb becomes a shepherd. And even in heaven, Jesus will minister to us and love us and lead us. So we got to sing. We got to keep moving. Because there's going to come a day that the power of love will overcome the love of power. And the message of the seals, trumpets, and bowls is hold on, help us on the way.